You've been told that failure is your best teacher, and maybe you believe that. Maybe you've said it yourself, but here's something nobody tells you. It's completely possible to fail 100 times in business, in relationships, in your health, in your finances, and walk away having learned almost nothing. Not because you're broken, not because you're weak, but because failure on its own doesn't teach you anything. You have to do the teaching, and that requires a kind of honesty most of us were never shown how to do. Today, we're going to talk about what failure actually reveals when you let it, how to separate the lesson from the shame, how to use failure as real information instead of either a verdict on your worth or a story you romanticize years later, and why the way you respond to failure might matter more to your growth than the failure itself. This is going to be a different conversation about failure, so stick with me. The myth that failure automatically teaches. So let's start by taking apart something that we've all accepted without much examination. Fail fast, fail forward. Every failure is a lesson. These phrases are everywhere in entrepreneurship and self help, in leadership culture. And I don't think they're wrong exactly, but I think they're incomplete in a way that actually causes harm. Because when we tell people that failure is automatically instructive, we skip the hardest part, the part where you have to choose to look at it clearly. Most people don't do that. Most people do one of two things instead. They either collapse into the failure, they let it become evidence about who they are, what they deserve, whether they're capable, they make it their identity, or they bounce off it. They get back up fast, they reframe it as a learning experience, they tell the story at dinner parties, and they move on without ever really sitting in the discomfort long enough to extract what it was actually trying to tell them. Both responses feel like coping, and they are, but neither one is learning. Failure only teaches when you're willing to examine it, honestly, without tuning into either shame or theater. So, if you think about somebody who's maybe tried something and they failed, and you'll see this sometimes with children because they don't have enough experience yet to figure out the lessons. And they try something that doesn't work. And when they set up to try it again, you notice that they haven't changed anything. Everything is exactly the same way, yet they're trying it again. And you think to yourself, from the outside, I can see that that isn't going to work, but they're going to do it anyway. That's persistence, but I don't know that they're learning anything. So maybe we think about a serial entrepreneur, right, who keeps launching without validating the market, or someone who keeps choosing the same kind of relationship dynamic and calling it bad luck when the same situation keeps playing itself out. Acknowledge that that is not a character flaw, right? It's super important that if you've been in that situation, you understand that that doesn't make you a bad person, it doesn't make you a failure, and it's not a character flaw. It's just what happens when we don't have a framework for processing failure. So, the difference between failing and learning from failing is an active process, not a passive one. We don't fail and then all of a sudden we're bestowed with all this additional wisdom. When we fail and then we analyze why we failed, we look at it, we be honest with ourselves about maybe things we could have done differently or how we approach things or what we could have prepared differently. That's where the learning comes from. That's where those distinctions become real and useful. Information versus identity. So here's the first real distinction I want you to hold on to today. Failure is information, it's not a verdict. When something doesn't work, when the business doesn't take off, when the relationship ends, when you don't get the role, when the habit falls apart, something real happened. There's data there. There are signals about what worked, what didn't, what you assume that turned out to be wrong, what you underestimated, what you weren't ready for. That's information, and information is useful. But the moment you let failure become a statement about who you are, well, I'm bad at this, or I'm not the kind of person who succeeds, I always do this, maybe I'm just not cut out for it. Now you've stopped processing information and started building a case against yourself. And here's the tricky part. That shift happens fast. It can happen within seconds of something going wrong. And once it happens, your brain isn't looking for lessons anymore. It's looking for confirmation. It's scanning your past for every other time you failed, building a narrative and getting further and further from anything useful. So the first move, and maybe the most important one, is catching that shift before it takes hold, noticing when you've moved from this didn't work to I don't work. You know, I know it, in my life and my career, I've had a lot of situations that have gone really well for me, and it was easy to feel, prideful and great about that. And then I've had situations where things did not work out. I've had product launches where I expected there to be really big results, and it totally flopped. And I've reacted in all different ways. When it happens to you once, it's easier to take a look at that, analyze it, and say, well, what went wrong? What could I have done differently? When it happens to you multiple times, that's when it gets even trickier and more challenging to be able to separate the event or the circumstance from who you are and your abilities and your innate success level or ability to make that happen. Maybe it's a hard conversation that went sideways, a failed job interview, in my case, a product launch that flopped. In all of those particular cases, that identity collapse isn't always dramatic, right? You get these little needling things in your ear whispering to you about your inadequacies and the things that you secretly know are not great about yourself or that are challenges or shortcomings. And that can be really quiet and slow, just gradual erosion of confidence that's disguised as realism. So again, once this happens multiple times, we start to build this narrative that that's who we are. We just aren't capable of that. But it works the other way too. Have you ever noticed those people that they protect their identity by externalizing all the blame? The market was bad, the timing was off, those people didn't get it. Something is always somebody else's fault. And in some cases, again, that may be true. But if we fail to look at anything and write everything off that doesn't go our way as some external problem, we also are powerless to be able to change anything. So it's a way of avoiding the information. Both extremes there, full self blame and full externalization, are ways of not learning. The gap between the pain and the learning. So there's something else that I want to name directly because I think it gets glossed over in most conversations about failure. Failure hurts, sometimes a lot. Not just the practical consequences, the money lost, the time spent, the relationship gone, but the emotional weight of it, the embarrassment, the grief, sometimes the humiliation, the feeling that you let someone down or that you let yourself down. And I want to be clear that pain is real and it does deserve space. But pain is not the same as learning. Pain is what happens to you. Learning is what you do with what happened. And one of the most common mistakes people make is confusing the two. They assume that because something hurt, it taught them, that because they went through it, they grew from it. But suffering alone doesn't produce wisdom. It just produces more suffering unless you're willing to do the work of converting it into something useful. There's also another layer here that's worth naming, and that's shame. Shame is different from guilt. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Shame says, I am something wrong. And when failure triggers shame, which it does for a lot of people, especially in high stakes arenas like career or finances or relationships, it becomes almost impossible to learn because the psyche is in protection mode. You're not curious about what happened. You're just trying to survive the feeling. So before you can extract a lesson from failure, sometimes you need to let the dust settle, not to avoid it, but to get to a place where you can look at it without being consumed by it. So when you feel a sense of shame, what ends up happening is you replay the situation over and over in your mind, and you continue with the negative self-talk where you tell yourself about how stupid you were for thinking you could do this, or what a bad idea this was, or everybody knew it wasn't going to work except you, and all of these other kinds of things. And so we're not curious, we're not explorative, we're in a protection mode, and we aren't able to learn in that place. So when someone fails publicly, whether it's a presentation that bombed, a pitch that got rejected in front of others, that instinct is to minimize, is to hide or to over-explain, not to examine it. If we distinguish between healthy self-accountability and self-flagellation, the first one is productive, the second one keeps you stuck. If you are trying to look at things and figure out what things you could have done differently, maybe there's nothing you could have done that would have changed the outcome, but there still is usually something you could have done differently. When you analyze that, you grow from it. When you're whipping yourself because you're such an idiot for doing all of it, That's where it becomes destructive and unhelpful. You aren't learning anything, you're just crushing your own confidence. And it's important that the timing matters on this. Right in the middle of the emotional storm is not the best time for deep analysis, and that's okay. Sometimes we feel like we want to process it because we're in this emotional state and we want out. But the lesson doesn't expire. Give yourself permission to feel it first, then look at it. We want to talk about processing and ruminating. And again, we've talked about this in other episodes as well. There's a difference. Processing is healthy. It's important to look at something, analyze it, think about what you could have done differently. Ruminating is replaying the negativity over and over. It's like in the movie Fever Pitch when he's sitting on the couch watching the ball go through Buckner's legs over and over again. That's ruminating. It isn't helping you. It's just making you feel progressively worse, and there's no value in that whatsoever. When we process and we learn from it, there's value in that. So processing moves you through something, ruminating keeps you circling. What failure actually reveals? Okay, so let's say that you've done that. Let's say you let the dust settle. You're not in a shame spiral. You're ready to actually look at what happened. What are you looking for? Here's what I found failure actually reveals when you're willing to see it. So I'm going to go through a few examples, and I think that these are really important because they help illustrate exactly what this is like. Maybe there were assumptions that you didn't know that you were making. Almost every failure has at least one assumption underneath it. You may not realize it at the time, but when you look back at it in the past tense, do you have a feeling that there was something you assumed going into the situation that ultimately turned out to be wrong? You expected someone to behave in a certain way. You expected the market to do this, or the deal to be that, or the product to do this. And when that isn't true, all the rest of what you were doing is invalidated. So the assumption you went into it, your fault or not, is something that didn't work out. Maybe you assumed your audience wanted what you built, or you assumed the relationship survived the conversation. You assumed that you had more time. Failure surfaces assumptions, and that part is incredibly useful if you're willing to look at it. Gaps in preparation or execution. Sometimes failure is simply about not being ready. It's not a verdict on your potential, but it's a signal that there was more to learn, more to build, more to practice before the attempt. And that's an honest, practical information. Misaligned expectations. A lot of what we call failure is really a mismatch between what we expected and what was realistic. And again, that's not always your fault. Sometimes it's based on what information you've got, but it's almost always something you can address going forward. That's where there's value. The systems and structures that didn't hold, especially relevant in business and health. Sometimes it's not that you failed, it's that your system failed. The habits weren't built. The support wasn't in place. The environment wasn't set up for the outcome that you wanted. That's not a moral failing. It's a design problem, and design problems have design solutions. Could be values misalignment. Sometimes failure is actually a redirect. You were pursuing something that looked right, but wasn't aligned with who you actually are or what actually matters to you. The failure is uncomfortable, but it's saving you from something worse. Ego and overconfidence. This one's a little harder to admit, but it's worth looking at honestly. Did you dismiss early warning signs thinking, I'll make it happen? Did you not ask for help because you thought you didn't need it? Did you skip steps because you thought you were above them? Most people who are honest can find this in at least some of their failures. It's not about beating yourself up again. It's about catching the pattern, timing and circumstance. And I want to include this one explicitly. Not all failure is your fault. Sometimes the market shifts. Sometimes the economy collapses. Sometimes you had genuinely incomplete information. There was somebody locally here that had a business and he was super successful making connections with all the local sports teams. And he was going to run events and host things at a venue for them. And he had a huge Rolodex. Everybody loved him. And the business took off. And within a few months, COVID hit. All in-person events were shut down statewide for years. His business didn't survive. It's not because he did anything wrong. And there's not even anything you could have done to anticipate COVID. But sometimes that happens. Now, sometimes you're working against systems or conditions that were unfair, and those are real also. Honest examination means being honest about this too, not using it as a blanket excuse, but also not carrying responsibilities for things that weren't yours to carry. The goal of examining failure isn't to assign blame to yourself or to anyone else. The goal is to understand what actually happened as clearly as you can see it so you can make better decisions going forward. That's it. That's all learning from failure really is. Why avoiding failure also avoids growth. I want to spend a minute on something that might apply to some of you more than the content that we've covered so far. Because there's a version of this episode that's relevant not just to people who have failed and are trying to process it, but to people who are so afraid of failing that they're not really trying at all. Avoiding failure feels safe. In the short term, it sure is. You don't have to feel the disappointment. You don't have to face the embarrassment. You don't have to explain to anyone what went wrong. But what you also don't get is feedback. So growth requires real world testing. You can plan, prepare, study, research, and all that's valuable and important. But at some point, you have to put the thing into the world, the relationship into practice, the decision into action. And until you do, you're just theorizing. Safe failure zones are small contained experiments where the stakes are low enough that failure is genuinely tolerable. And that is how you can build a track record with yourself and some resiliency if need be. You prove to yourself that you can fail and that you can recover from it before you take on something that might be devastating. So if we think about that and we relate that to the people who seem most resilient, most of the time what we see is that they aren't the ones who've suffered the most. They're the ones who have a longer history of surviving failure and coming out the other side. And that history gets built by actually trying and by not giving up. So avoiding failure is sometimes disguised as perfectionism, waiting until something's ready, it's perfect, it's polished before putting it out. But perfection is often just a delay strategy in a nice outfit. So here's the thing about risk. You're taking it either way. If you try and fail, you risk the disappointment, the wasted resources, the bruised ego. If you don't try, you risk your time, your potential, your sense of what you're capable of, slowly and quietly over years. Neither path is without cost, but only one of them gives you information. Only one of them builds the version of you who knows what they're capable of because they tested it. So how to examine failure without spiraling? All right, so we've established that failure can teach you, but only if you're willing to examine it honestly. So the question is, how do you do that without turning it into a shame spiral or an endless replay loop? Because most of us have experienced that. You think you're being reflective and productive, and suddenly it's 2 a.m. and you're replaying the moment it went wrong for the 14th time and feeling progressively worse. That's not examination. That's rumination, like we talked about, and it's absolutely not the same thing. So we want to keep this really simple, and we want to put this in a way where we can actually deploy and use this. So it's important to be able to put time and space between the event and the analysis. When something happens, give yourself the grace of a little bit of time. You can even put it on the calendar so you commit to doing it, that you're going to analyze it later. But you don't have to process failure the same day it happens. And in fact, sometimes if it's really emotional, you shouldn't, because you aren't going to be thinking clearly then either. Let the emotional intensity come down first, then look at it, write it out. There's something about putting failure on paper, what happened, what you thought would happen, where the gap was, that makes it less overwhelming and more workable. It externalizes it. So you're looking at it instead of being inside it. Separate what you can learn from what you need to grieve. Some losses deserve grief, not just analysis. A relationship ending, a business you cared about not making it. Giving yourself permission to grieve something doesn't prevent you from learning from it. It often makes learning possible. Talk it through with someone who'll be honest with you, not just supportive. Support matters, but so does perspective. Find someone who cares enough about you, who will ask you the hard questions, not just tell you it wasn't your fault or that you'll be fine. Be specific, because vague reflection produces vague lessons. I need to be more disciplined. It's not really a lesson, it's a wish. I skipped 3 check-in calls with my team and missed a critical misunderstanding that cost us 2 weeks is a lesson. Be specific about what happened and what you'd do differently next time. The goal isn't to feel worse. The goal isn't to feel better either, not yet. The goal is to understand. Understanding is what gives you something you can actually use. So, what failure builds in you when you work with it? Let's talk about what's on the other side of this because I don't want to make this episode feel like homework. Like failure is just a grim assignment that you have to complete before you can move on. There are things that failure builds in you genuinely over time that you can't get any other way. Not from books, not from watching other people's journeys, not from planning. And the first one is resilience, like we talked about. Resilience is super important because it allows you to have that strength to continue going when things don't go your way. And in life, let's face it, a lot of times things aren't going to go your way. So when we talk about resilience, I don't mean the motivational poster version of the person pumping their fist in the air. I mean real resilience. It's quieter than it sounds. It lives under the surface. But it's that lived knowledge that you've survived hard things before and you can do it again, that the world didn't end, that you found a way through. Every failure you process honestly and survive adds to that record. Over time, that record becomes something you can draw on. You become, in a real and practical sense, harder to knock over. Humility, genuine humility, not false modesty, but the kind that comes from knowing firsthand how much you don't know, how many variables you can't control, how many times your confidence has outrun your competence. That kind of humility makes you more coachable, more curious, more accurate in your assessments. Discernment. This is one people don't talk about enough. The ability to tell what's worth your energy and what isn't. We have unlimited opportunities and unlimited ways to spend our time, and we're constantly pulled in multiple directions. What opportunities are solid versus what looks attractive but has the same structure as something that burned you before? You can't develop that discernment in theory. You develop it by having things not work out, understanding why, and carrying that pattern recognition forward. Self-trust. Seems counterintuitive, I know. How does failure build self-trust? But here's how it works. When you fail and you don't fall apart, when you make a mistake and you don't disappear, when something goes wrong and you handle it with a degree of honesty and grace, you learn that you can be trusted. Not to always succeed, but to be honest, to face things, to show up even after it hurts. That's the deeper version of self-trust, and it's worth a lot more than confidence that's never been tested. So none of this happens automatically. It happens when you choose, and it is a choice, to treat failure as part of the process of becoming rather than evidence that you're not going to make it. That's a different relationship with failure than most people have. And it changes everything about how you move through the harder parts of building a life that you actually want. Practical questions to ask after a failure. So I want to give you something concrete to take away from today's episode, because all of this is great in theory, but what does it look like in practice? Here are the questions I think are worth sitting with after a meaningful failure. So it's important that we look at this in a way where we can analyze it, but do it in a way where it's productive. So we can ask, what did I expect to happen and what actually happened? And then map that gap. That gap is where the information lives. What did I assume going in that turned out to not be true? This is often one of the most valuable questions because assumptions are invisible until something proves them wrong. Then in hindsight, if we're willing to go back and look, we can see we mistakenly believed X. What did I know going in that I didn't fully act on? Sometimes we fail not because we lacked information, but because we ignored or minimized it. That's important to see, so we don't have that same blind spot next time. What was outside my control and what was within it? Be honest in both directions. Don't overown what wasn't yours, and don't underown what was. What would I do differently, specifically? Not I'd be more careful. What exactly would be different about the preparation, the execution, the timing, the communication? What does this reveal about what I actually value? Sometimes failure redirects us. It shows us we are chasing something that didn't align with who we actually are. That's worth knowing even when it's uncomfortable. What's one thing I could do differently in the next attempt that accounts for what I know now? One concrete behavioral thing, that's it. You don't have to overhaul everything. You just have to take one thing forward. And you don't have to answer all these every time. But if you can honestly answer even 2 or 3 of them after something goes wrong, you haven't wasted the experience, you've used it. And that's the whole thing, really. The mistakes people make when trying to learn from failure. Now, before we close, I want to name a few of the common mistakes people make when they're trying to do this right because good intentions aren't always enough. And some of these are subtle. So, rushing to the lesson is one of the mistakes. The failure just happened. You're still in the thick of it emotionally. You're not thinking clearly, and you're already trying to extract meaning from it. Sometimes you just need to let things settle first. The lesson will still be there next week. Finding the lesson you wanted to find. This is a sneaky one. You go in telling yourself you're being reflective, but you're actually just confirming what you already believed. Real examination sometimes reveals things you didn't want to see. If your post failure reflection is too comfortable, it might not be honest. Turning the lesson into a story instead of a change. You process the failure, you find the insight, you even share it with people, and then nothing changes. The real test of learning isn't articulation, it's behavior. What did you actually do differently? Overgeneralizing from one failure. One failed business doesn't mean you're not an entrepreneur. One difficult relationship doesn't mean you're bad at intimacy. One bad investment doesn't mean you have no financial instincts. Context matters. Be careful about conclusions that stretch beyond what the data actually supports. Undergeneralizing from repeated patterns. On the flip side, if you had the same kind of failure multiple times in similar circumstances, that pattern is real and worth examining more seriously than a one-off. Patterns are trying to tell you something, making it purely about mindset. There's a tendency in personal development circles to attribute everything to mindset, and mindset matters genuinely, no doubt. But sometimes failure is about skills, resources, systems, timing, or access. Attributing it all to how you are thinking can be a way of avoiding the more concrete, fixable things. Learning from failure is not a single moment of clarity. It's a discipline, a practice of honest examination that you get a little better with every time you're willing to do it. So let me leave you with this. Failure is not your enemy, but it's also not automatically your teacher. It's raw material. What you do with that material, whether you let it become your identity or whether you mine it for what it actually contains, that's entirely up to you. And I know that can feel like pressure, like one more thing you have to do right after something already went wrong. But I think it's actually the opposite. It means failure doesn't have to have the final word. You do. You get to decide what a failure means, not in a pretend way, not in a manifest your way out of it way, but in the very real, practical, grounded sense that the story isn't over. The information is there. The next move is yours. That's what growth looks like, not some clean upward line, a messy, human, honest process of becoming, one hard experience at a time.